Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Maia, who is a female to male to female detransitioner, or a D-sister. She has a very interesting gender journey, so-called, and we speak about that. And we also speak about her time in Israel and her unique perspective on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So this is Detrans Plus content right here. You can find her via the links below. And if you enjoy this content, please like, subscribe, share, and consider donating via the tip jars, also found in the description. Without further ado, here is Maia. How's the United States treating you?
It's going well. I mean, it was kind of unexpected for me to be here at this time. Definitely would not have predicted that, but so far I'm enjoying my time back despite the circumstances of coming here in the first place. But yeah, I've been getting involved more in this like gender activism. So that's
okay.
turning lemons into lemonade, I suppose.
I guess it might be a little more fun and safe than getting into the whole Middle East conflict activism in
Yeah.
in the city in which you are, which we don't have to mention, but I'm sure that's pretty
Yes.
hotsy-totsy out there.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't be an in-person activist for anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in the city that I'm in. But I find that there are actually a lot of connections between what's going on in the Middle East and the way that this discourse around gender ideology is playing out here in the United States. I've been seeing
Really?
connections left, right, and center.
Could the connection be communism?
Could be. But I'm
What do you think
seeing,
it is?
well, we know that on the left, these two ideas are very connected to each other. The sort of the pro-Palestinian position that is based on Western idealization of what's going on, Western naivete towards terrorism and things of that nature. And we know that these ideas have just been lumped together on the left, that you have to be like pro-gender ideology at its most extreme level and pro-Palestinian at its most extreme level. And there's just a certain like uncritical acceptance of those ideas.
Queers for Palestine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a pretty, I consider it to be pretty fallacious movement in and of itself because I have gay Palestinian friends, one of whom was unfortunately killed in an honor killing by a member of his family after finding out that he was gay. And he was just like he was a really cool guy, 21 years old, super brilliant art student. And so, yeah, like
Hmm.
these Western leftists just don't know what they're talking about. But
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, do they know what they're talking about with regard to gender? Or what's your point of view on their point of view? And how has your point of view changed over the years?
Yeah. So I am 24 years old and I grew up in the United States. I started identifying as trans when I was 12 years old in the year 2012. So I got
Okay.
into it really quite soon, sooner than everybody else. And
Hmm.
so I really saw the whole movement evolve over time. Back when I got into it, the trans movement wasn't denying biological sex, although they did believe in the gendered soul. But they weren't denying biological sex. Non-binary wasn't even a thing for another several years after that. And yeah, I guess what more do you want to know? Do you want to know about my story of like
How do you know you're
desistance or
trans at 12? Like, what's going
oh,
on in a 12-year-old's mind where they can believe such a thing?
oh, okay. Well, I guess it all started when I was for my 12th birthday, I got an iPad as a birthday gift. So
Oh,
I had
no.
internet access. Yeah. That's how it all starts, isn't it? So I got an iPad. And the thing is that for me, the whole trans thing, it wasn't the first topic of my interest that I had spent a lot of hours on the internet researching. before trans, it was the world's tallest people. It started, I had a Guinness Book of World Records and I was leafing through it and I saw the page on the world's tallest people.
Hmm.
And I
Did
wanted
you
to figure
identify
out,
from then on as the world's tallest person? Did you
no,
go to the
no,
Endocrine Society? Because they've tried to do that. They've tried to grow children taller and shorter.
really.
Yeah, the
Well,
same science, quote unquote, that's being used to trans kids was used to correct their height. So,
that doesn't surprise me. But for me, it was more that, so in the process of doing deep research about that topic, I realized that the reason that these people were so tall is because they had a tumor on the pituitary gland of their brain. And so that impacted, the secretion of growth hormones and caused asymmetric growth. And these people died often very young, because in some cases, like their heart would overgrow their rib cage, and so the heart stops beating at that point.
wow.
And so I was like 8 or 9 when I got really into this topic, and I wanted to know everything there was to know about it. So I did very deep, intense research about that to the point where, I mean, I just didn't even care what was going on around me. I mean, I never particularly tracked anything that was going on in school. I sort of just, like, I put on a school uniform every day. And really, until I got diagnosed with and medicated for ADHD at the age of 14, I'd show up to school every day and just didn't know why I was there. Like, I just didn't know that you go to school to learn things, because I was
Okay.
just in my mind contemplating my own ideas. So yeah, trans wasn't the first obsession intellectually, but it did give me, the world's tallest people obsession did give me a lot of research skills.
Okay. Okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Deep dive,
so
independent study kind of stuff. Could we pause on this ADHD and the medicalization aspect for you? How did you realize something was going on, and what was your relationship to medicine being the cure for you?
hmm. Well, I don't know if that's a question that I've ever been asked. Let's see.
Welcome to my channel. That's what we do here.
So as far as medicine being the cure, I mean, I grew up in a household where one of my parents is from the Soviet Union, and so there's naturally a sort of there's a pretty natural skepticism around all kinds of institutions, just because they are institutions. So there's always a skepticism around that. Like when I was sick, instead of taking cold medicine, there would be all kinds of home remedies like mustard seed in one's socks before they go to sleep,
Oh,
just all kinds of stuff like that. So there was a natural skepticism around that. But I don't think I thought that deeply about it because I was 12. I mean, I was feeling a lot of things that I just didn't know how to make sense of.
yeah.
And I was just desperately searching for answers because nobody told me, what was really going on with me. And so I was left to sort of try to figure it out on WebMD, which, as we know, is the best way to turn normal symptoms that you're having in your body into full blown hypochondria over like 5 different cancers that you probably don't have.
Yeah. Yeah. How how did you sense that there was something off or different, or what you said wrong with you?
Hmm. Well, it all started. So when I was 12, I one day in class. Well, I guess I'll say it like this: every American kid who's attended any kind of formal schooling is familiar with the American classroom ritual of taking a worksheet and passing it down. And this was a non-event for me until I was like 12. And one day, my hand, in the process of taking a worksheet and passing it down, one day my hand brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates, and my heart rate started to skyrocket. I turned bright red. I was sweaty and dizzy. I had lost the ability to form coherent sentences, and I didn't know what that was. I was not familiar with the idea of a crush. I thought that crush was like that can of orange soda. And I thought my peer group was just obsessed with that, with the soda. I didn't
Oh,
actually know that what I was experiencing was a crush. And because I was like a little researcher, I just went online and typed the symptoms in, and naturally came to the conclusion that I was probably suffering from like some kind of, cancer, some kind of neurodegenerative
mm,
disease that was going to kill me very shortly.
wow.
Um, so
That's
I
precious.
really, so I just really didn't know what was going on. And yeah, like I didn't know how to make sense of that experience. And around the same time, well, because I didn't know how to make sense of anything, like we know that around, middle school or whenever it is that kids start to experience crushes, um, there is this natural tendency for boys and girls to separate. If they not that in elementary school they're particularly co-ed, but I think they're much more co-ed in elementary school even than they are in middle school, precisely because of that, because it's awkward to hang around, the target of your attraction. It's extremely awkward. Um, and so I started hanging around the boys, and this was different for me because I never really had friends my age, girls or boys. I mean, I would just kind of hang around the lonely kid, no matter how insufferable they were, or like no matter how little we had in common, just because I didn't want them to be alone. But I'd never formed like meaningful, deep friendships. And I was much better friends with my teachers and with adults in my life than I was with kids, because which kids are interested in pituitary tumors, right? Or in rare diseases. Like we just didn't have anything in common. But around this time, when I was starting to have all of these odd sensations in my body that I didn't know how to make sense of, I basically, I started hanging around the boys because I realized that I don't feel these sensations when I'm around them. So I can function with a greater level of ease. And I realized that, if I were to team up with the boys and form like a strategic alliance, we could basically all like pull pranks on the teacher and therefore win the affections of the girls in the class. And I also, at that time, I went to a school where we didn't have to wear uniforms. So I had to develop like my own sense of style. And I just thought that my male classmates were dressing in a really like fashionable and like snazzy way. And I wanted to emulate that. I also had become pretty obsessed with the Ellen DeGeneres show. I was in awe of her. She was very charismatic and somebody who I really looked up to. And I also admired her style. And so I guess all of these things were floating around in my mind at that time. And I went, searching for answers. And I guess another important thing to note is that because I did grow up in a progressive American city on the West Coast, I had seen growing up people who were gender nonconforming, mostly men, people who were like very obviously male, but who were wearing like dresses and skirts, things of that nature. And I'd been exposed to the idea of a sex change, and it was explained as like, a woman's soul in a man's body. Like this was a really well accepted idea before gender ideology decided to, consume every single institution within Western society and eat our society from within. So this was an accepted idea, and I wanted to know whether or not it was possible to go the other way around, meaning from female to male. And so, like the good little researcher that I was, I went on the internet and I found my answer.
Which was how did you find the answer? Like on Reddit, or like was it on a medical forum then?
Yeah.
Okay. And how was it described to you that it evoked your sympathy or identification?
Well, because this was like half of my lifetime ago, I don't remember like every single detail because none of this was like really recent. But
yeah,
the way they described it is like through, I mean, it's basically a lot of the stuff that kids see today, although today it's dressed up with like colorful hair and, pushed on TikTok. But a lot of the talking points were the same, like the ideas of like, if you're not comfortable in your body, or, if you feel like you have a male soul. I mean, all of these, just these talking points that I now don't subscribe to. Like I would say that the talking points themselves were actually quite similar to today's, although they were more traditional, meaning that they didn't, like non-binary was not concept yet. It wouldn't become a concept even in the most like niche spaces, probably for another 2 years. So, I mean, I guess a lot of things were going through my mind, and I didn't realize that what I was experiencing was attraction to girls. And so when I started to, hang out with the boys and want to emulate them to, have a joint strategy of how to get girls, like I didn't even realize I was doing that. So I automatically felt a certain level of like kinship with the guys that I didn't have with the girls. Like I certainly couldn't relate to the girls. I mean, if I tried to be around them for more than a couple minutes, I would just get so flustered that I would
Hmm.
like lose the ability to form coherent sentences, which I really didn't like because I like to talk and I like to talk about areas of my interest, regardless of whether or not other people share them. That's the way that I was as a kid, especially. So I was just trying to make sense of an experience that I now have better language and ability to conceptualize because I am 24. But at that time, I was just trying to figure out like what was going on. And at first, I thought I was developing some kind of a sickness. Um, and then, like, this trans idea captivated me because I thought, well, maybe these feelings aren't like evidence of some kind of symptoms that are a result of some kind of a tumor forming in my body, but maybe it's like something different that actually that can be treated and that I can move on
Mm.
and live a life.
And what about the ADHD and the medicalization that you were subjected to alleviate you of those symptoms?
So I always had like learning issues. So I was born really early. I think I was born at 32 weeks, and at birth I weighed 2 pounds and 11 ounces.
Okay.
So my entire life I've had like odd developmental problems in some. So I never crawled. Um, I and when I walked, I just didn't have the ability to. I didn't develop the skills from crawling to be able to pick myself up when I fell.
Hmm.
So that was like my first stint in like some kind of physical therapy. I was probably like not even 1 years old yet. I wore leg braces for some period of time when I was a kid to correct toe walking. I got Botox injections in my legs and wore leg braces. I was in speech therapy. I didn't learn how to tie my shoes until I was 14. And I also didn't learn how to swallow properly, swallow liquids properly until I was 14. I had to learn that in speech therapy.
Hmm.
So I had all kinds of odd developmental problems along the way. And
Hmm.
I had on one hand intellectual gifts that were present at a very young age. But then when I started school, it became very clear, especially to my parents, that my there was a massive gap between my capabilities and my performance. And I talked earlier about just being in school every single day and just really just not knowing why I was there. I would go through this ritual. I'd put on the uniform and then I would just sit in class, and I would always have to try to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing, what's going on. I had before I was medicated for ADHD at the age of 14. I had a lot of close calls with cars, being hit by cars, simply because of the fact that waiting for the traffic light to turn green so that I could cross the road was fundamentally not interesting to me. And what we know about ADHD is that it's interest based focus rather than importance based focus. So while it
Hmm.
would be important to pay attention to the traffic light, it was not in any way interesting to me. What was much more interesting was like whatever topic I was contemplating in my mind at that time. So I just didn't pay attention to anything that was going on around me. So
Hmm.
it really was quite a significant safety risk, as well as like falling behind in school. I mean, my entire childhood, I was just studying the entire time. Part of that is because, you know, the Soviet Jewish background and the importance placed on education. That's definitely part of it. But the other part of it is just that I was having severe academic difficulties. And if I wanted to have any kind of a life where I didn't have to study every single waking minute just to catch up to where I was supposed to be, I think the medicine actually really did help me and improve my life because I haven't gotten hit by a car. So
Hmm. Well, okay, so it's adaptive. How did it make you feel? How did it change you, like internally, emotionally, connections to human beings, in that way?
yeah, it was really interesting. The first week that I took the meds, I really hated them because I was, for the first time in my life, forced to pay attention to things that I didn't find interesting. So I had to sit in class and like there was nothing I could do to not pay attention to the boring lecture. Um, but like after a week, I realized that there was this whole world that I'd been totally checked out of for 14 years, which is the world that everybody else lives in.
Oh.
Yeah, like I learned a lot of social skills while I was on this medicine, because
Hmm.
when I was when I was much younger, I think my mom especially had noticed that I was not picking up on social cues, and
Yeah.
she would have to tell me that, in order to have a conversation with other people, you have to ask them questions. You can't just lecture at them. You have to like come up with some questions to ask. And so, she told me that, and I took it in stride. It was very helpful. She ended up being right on that. You do actually have to ask people questions to have conversations with them. And I picked up many more social cues after being on the meds simply because of the fact that I had to pay attention to them. I didn't
Okay.
have any other choice.
Yeah. How did that
So
change
I
your
think,
relationship to boys and girls and the sex aspect or the sexed aspect?
so the first year that I was medicated, I was actually in an all girls Catholic school for a year,
Oh,
which is particularly funny because I'm Jewish. Um, but
and
there were
Russian.
people of,
You should have been
yeah,
in a Jewish Orthodox school or something.
I don't think that would have gone so well for me either. I think so. Being in a sex segregated environment when I really just did not know how to relate to girls was
Yeah.
quite difficult. It was really hard for me to make friends, and especially with all those hormones coursing through your body, like that was somewhat of an impossible situation. I would do this
Hmm.
thing where I took up arts and crafts. And there was a period of time where I basically just made like felt flower um, bobby pins for every single girl in my class,
Yeah.
hoping that I
Yeah.
would gain like any of their affections. So I did that, but I didn't know how to really relate to them at all. And I was taking a Russian literature course at the nearby university at that time with a bunch of college students, and I found that to be much more fruitful because it's always been easier for me to relate to adults than it has been for me to relate to people my own age. But then I went to a public school the next year after that. And I would say that that's when I sort of discovered speech and debate, competitive speech and debate. And I
Oh,
really found my stride and a social group within that, because I ended up being somewhat of a natural at public speaking, and especially after I'd learned some basic rules around argumentation.
hmm.
And that sort of helped me, find my crew of people. And I got even deeper into philosophy, into politics,
Hmm.
into all kinds of things. I mean,
Where where was the
yeah.
trans identity at this time? How was that
So
developing? Or are
yeah.
you living with that?
So my parents did not affirm. They were very
But
ahead
you
of their
came out
time.
to
And
them. I'm sorry. We didn't talk
yeah,
about this
yeah,
aspect.
when I
So
was
at
12.
12, when you're 12, you're just
Yeah.
like, Mama, I'm a boy.
It was a bit more like emotionally fraught than that. The
Oh,
conversation didn't go particularly well. It actually went spectacularly horribly,
oh
and it
no.
made me, come to the conclusion that I just can't tell my parents anything.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so yeah, it was not handled, I would say, in the best way. But I can't blame anybody because it's obviously parents would panic in that kind of a situation. And in 2012, it was
Did you
absolutely
come
unheard
out
of.
as a boy, like I'm a boy, or I'm a trans? I'm a trans man that needs to be medicalized. Like, to what degree did you like introduce the concept? And I asked that not just for any sort of details about that particular conversation, but about how you conceptualized the medicalization path that you would assumably venture to a certain degree down.
Mm. So I believe that the way I said it, so actually, I didn't even want to say it out loud, and so I'd had my parents guess, and actually on the third try they did. Um, and I
Hmm.
believe that what I'd said was like that I wanted to be a boy, that I feel like I should have been a boy, um, and that I wanted to transition. I wouldn't have said trans boy. I don't think anybody was talking like that back then.
Okay. But you wanted to transition,
Yes.
specifically medically.
Yes.
Do you recall to what degree you understood what that meant at that time? And then how did your understanding of that process develop over the
Mm.
next few years?
Well, I thought I understood what it entailed. I mean, I had gone so deep into the subject. I knew about the puberty blockers. I was, of course, I'd already been in puberty for several years, so I had come to the conclusion that, like, I'm already kind of too far gone, but I should just stop everything from happening like right away. I wanted to go on the cross sex hormones. I wanted the whole shebang. Um, like all of the procedures and everything. I wanted all of it. I just wanted normalcy. Like I didn't know how to make sense of what was actually going on with me. So
Okay.
I wanted the path that could give me a very like sort of clear framework for
Yeah.
how to grow up and be an adult.
Yeah. You've mentioned, or the way that you've described transition or transition ideation up to this point has to do, or has had to do with social and, I guess, personality or psychological aspects. What about your body? What was your relationship to your body? Disgust, despair, dislike, no care? Like, what was that weird transition period, the natural transition that we call puberty, like for you?
Well, I hit puberty really quite young. Um,
Huh.
I would say that
Born
before
young,
I,
go puberty young. You're living a fast life. Wow.
yeah, I guess so. I think that what what was going through my mind is like, well, when I hit puberty, I hadn't even developed like a full like concept of sex constancy or sex permanence. Like I still didn't fully understand, that I was going to grow up and be a woman, really until puberty started happening. Because I had some developmental delays. Like I was your classic like
Hmm.
smart kid who some things just like didn't stick for, and
Yeah.
that was one of them. That type of cognizance usually develops, at the latest by the age of 8 for kids, but usually they start developing it around the age of 5. But for me, I
Hmm.
was like, you know, right before my 10th birthday when I started noticing changes, and even then I was in denial about it for quite a while, until the changes started, becoming like less avoidable. And then I thought like, oh shit, this is like really happening. Like
Hmm.
I actually am a girl. Like people aren't screwing with me. Um, so I had, yeah. So I didn't fully develop that understanding. And so naturally I was pretty confused. Um, and as far as like, I think I was just pretty disconnected from my body, probably just because of the same way that I was disconnected from society and other people because of the ADHD or whatever is really going on with me.
Yeah.
I wasn't connected to my physical body. I frankly didn't find it to be like very consequential or important because I just had this very rich inner life,
Hmm.
with my thoughts, with just
Okay.
me and my thoughts. But despite that being like very extroverted and wanting to share my ideas and discuss my ideas with other people. So I think in
Hmm.
general, there was just a great deal of disconnect.
Okay. And then, so fast forwarding to 14, 15, 16, you're in debate club, you're getting along, you find your niche, you hit your stride. What was the idea of transition at that point? Were you secretly trans, or were you only trans to certain groups? Were you still transmaxing?
Well, I mean, my parents would never have allowed me to come out as that. That just
Okay.
wasn't,
And you
yeah, it
guys
wasn't an
didn't fight
option.
about it. It wasn't even on the
No, we
table.
did.
So it was
I mean,
just,
we fought quite a bit, but it was actually more so about the gender non-conformity specifically. That was
oh,
more
okay.
the sort of sticking point, in the relationship. Just that entire thing as a whole.
You like to
Um,
be dapper, not pretty.
yes, exactly, and that was a massive problem,
Hmm.
in my home life.
Yeah.
So I would like I for debate competitions, like all the boys were wearing ties, and I also wanted to wear ties, but what I didn't, they were all wearing their dad's old boring ties, nothing fashionable, kind of frumpy looking, kind of tacky. So I actually made my own bow ties. I sewed them by hand because I wasn't actually allowed to purchase any of them. So I'd sew them by hand, and I would wear them to debate tournaments. That also got me a lot of attention from the girls, which was nice because at that point I
Oh,
had realized that that's what I was actually, you know, I had, two and two came together, and I realized what was actually going on. It
how
took
was
a
that
couple of
news for
years.
you to grok that? Again, you're in post. I mean, pre insanity pride, but post, gay marriage era, like everything's kind of normalized. There's GSA clubs or whatever. It's this pre-groomer level, just but a general openness towards homosexuality specifically. How did that news hit you? Did you care? Did you feel bad? Did you feel
I
liberated?
mean, I was quite excited, but like the thing is that because it was a massive issue, like with my parents, because of the sort of background that Soviet background, because it was such a big issue.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Even to be gay like that. I mean, I
So
had
you're living in a
girls.
progressive land, but
Yeah,
your home life is rather conservative comparatively, traditional.
yeah, traditional, probably more than conservative. I mean, yeah, I think that it's just parents worry when, it's a tale as old as time. Kids who end up different from their parents end up fighting with it, like fighting about it, like with their parents. It's like
Yeah.
parents want their kids, they want to know that their kids are going to be okay. And with me, it was just problems from the start since early birth. So I think that all
Hmm.
of this, including the gender nonconformity, I mean, that was probably just treated as like another problem, just like the toe walking or like the lack of ability to tie shoes until the age of 14 or any of these other things. Like, I think it was just seen in the same light as that, something that needs to be squashed and like, you know,
Corrected.
um, corrected. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So did that give rise to neurosis or defiance on your point, and then some sort of social acting out just to relieve pressure?
No, I mean, I would just say that I had a bunch of secret girlfriends.
Oh,
That I was like just absolutely terrified that somebody would like out me to my parents or
okay.
that somebody would post a picture. It was extremely stressful, like
Okay.
especially when my younger brother started attending the same school as me. Um, Even though he didn't sort of share those ideas, I didn't know that he didn't share those same ideas. So I was just paranoid all the time, basically throughout high school. But in general, because of this debate, because of the success that I was having in debate, I really thrived
Hmm.
overall. So I had something that my parents could be proud of, but I also had this aspect of my life that I had to go through um, my first relationships and my first heartbreaks entirely alone,
Right.
and I didn't feel like I could tell anybody about it, not even other peers my age, because I was just so cripplingly paranoid that
Oh,
somebody
yeah.
would tell
Okay.
on me.
Yeah. Was there any like kind of whiff of coolness about being a undercover lesbian? Like a black ops lesbian, like keeping something hidden yourself, getting away with something. I mean, just to like kind of balance out that picture of heavy paranoia, was there something pleasing about having to undergo like such a process of sneakiness? Some people like being sneaky. Do you like being sneaky? Or was that
I think that
alienating?
I think that part of my personality came out much later when I ended up moving to Israel. But back in high
Oh,
school, yeah.
fair enough. Okay.
But in high school, I would say that
Yeah.
no, like it was entirely a distressing experience, minus the fact that uh, like those first like puppy love is just an like indescribably amazing feeling, and
Hmm.
so I felt that, and that was nice. It was nice to have girlfriends and things of that nature. But I mean, I didn't get any pleasure from being sneaky. I was
Okay.
really constantly in some level of paranoia or distress
Yeah.
about it.
So did that then, in the other way, did it become like some sort of neurotic fixation on covering your tracks and like spending too much time obsessively about, being secretive? Or was it just this kind of general pressure? I just wondering to what degree did that impact further decisions and impact your decision to transition?
Yeah, I think they're very related. I think that I'm sure that it was excessive, although there's no like objective way to measure,
Yeah.
I guess, like to what extent is any kind of fixation too much of a fixation. I think if anything, every single fixation I've ever had in my life has probably been on the excessive side.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. I
with
mean,
all of my interests sort of
yeah,
overtaking every other aspect of my life.
yeah.
But yeah, this one was not fun, like researching the rare brain tumor that makes people super tall. Like this was not a fun fixation. This was
Hmm.
this I was terrified. I mean, I
Okay.
was yeah.
So when did you decide? So I assume, just trying to fill in the gaps here, that your parents wouldn't let you medicalize while you are a minor. So how did you continue to, after finding out that you're just lesbian, and then still wanting to transition? Like, how did you continue thinking about being trans or wanting to be transed?
So there were near the end of my high school experience, there were a couple of years when just my gender nonconforming appearance was like making my home life so hellish that I
Okay.
did decide to dress in a more feminine way. Also because I knew I would be able to I would get away with like being seen in public with the same girl over and over and over again. Because if I'm super butch and she's really feminine, people will put two and two together. But if I
Hmm.
look more girly, then it could just easily be a friendship.
Yeah.
Although anybody who would have known me um, decently well probably would have been suspicious because I'd never really had female friends. I always just kind of hung around in a group of guys and we would discuss philosophy and things of that nature.
Okay.
So I did that, and I think my parents thought, "Oh, thank God, this is all over." But all in the back of my mind, it was very strategic. Like every decision I made was incredibly strategic, and I thought, like, okay, my parents are gonna like give me a bit more freedom. I can get away with, doing stuff with girls, and then I'm gonna go to college, and that's when I'm gonna do it. So I went to university, and
Wait, you're gonna do it? Why would what are you gonna just I'm sorry to drill down into this, but like what did you think you were going to do and why?
live as a guy. I was gonna live as a guy.
Why? Why live as a guy? Why not just live as you?
Well, because I thought that my inner essence, I bought into the belief of the gendered soul.
Okay.
I thought that my inner essence was that of guy.
Okay.
Um, so the natural logical conclusion of that is if I have a male soul or male brain and a female body, that therefore I need to align the body with the mind because I had tried to align my appearance with what was expected of a member of my biological sex, and it just made me even more distressed. So
Yeah.
I thought, like, this is just further um,
Hmm.
reification of the idea that actually I should have just been born a guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why would being girly, whatever that means, cause you distress? Could you just describe the discongruence between that fashion has to do with like the expression of your personality, feeling at home in your body?
Well, I just didn't really like the clothes I was wearing. I really tried to get myself to like the clothes that I was wearing, but just everything about them. I mean, it felt like I was putting on a costume every day.
Hmm.
I knew that, I was getting like sort of warmth at home over that, not constant comments, negative comments. Um, so that made my life like a lot easier. But because I had to compromise on something that I really, really wanted for so long, and that compromise is what was getting me the type of affection that I really wanted. Uh, that made me feel even worse because it made me realize like it just made me think that my home is a microcosm of the world, which now I understand is like a fallacious idea because there's like literally no way that's possible. But as a kid, you have a very simplistic worldview. So I just thought, if I continue to dress feminine, like that, I'll have to put up with this. I'll have to do this if I want to be accepted socially, if I want to get girlfriends or anything of that nature.
Okay.
Um, and so I basically, I realized that like the only the like I didn't have the framework of just being a bush lesbian. Like I knew of that idea, but I didn't know what it looked like because there weren't really lesbian communities by the time I was like coming of age at university. Like they already just didn't exist.
They
At least
transed.
with yeah, either that or they were infiltrated by men. Um,
Hmm.
so so on multiple levels, these communities didn't exist within my age group. So it was I was trying to figure out like how do I want to go about living my life. Um, with this certain set of constraints. And for me, one of the constraints was my female body that I saw as being at odds with who I actually was and how I wanted to dress. I mean, I basically just thought that, that everybody would think that I was, disgusting or unsightly to look at because that
Oh,
is, that was told to me by adults in my
hmm.
life. And
Yeah.
so that's really what compelled me to want to assume a more like normative male appearance so that people would stop giving me shit for all
Okay.
intents and purposes.
Did you want any part of the male physique just for its own sake? Like you just really wanted sideburns or something like that? No.
No, I just
You didn't
wanted
fetishize
normalcy.
it, and I don't mean just like sexualize it, but just like kind of concentrate on one aspect or another of masculinity. Covet.
Honestly, I just wanted like, the haircuts and the clothes. Like,
Yeah.
and I saw the medical transition as a way for people to like stop giving me shit about the fact that I wanted to wear like vests and bow ties,
Okay.
basically.
Yeah.
Like I wanted to be normal and I didn't think that even women could love me like this. Like I thought that either I had to be super feminine because that's what I'm attracted to in women is femininity. Like I didn't realize that there was a role for somebody like me in a
Yeah.
homosexual relationship where there's like zero medical element involved. I
Yeah.
thought either I had to be super girly or I had to transform myself into the closest approximation of a heterosexual male that I could. Like I just
Yeah.
didn't see a possibility of choosing a non-medicalized path. Like it didn't cross my mind.
Well, going back to you being well, colloquially, from my culture, we call it a nerd, but highly research-based mentality. I guess is the more PC way of saying it. To what degree did you research the consequences of, let's say, testosterone on your body, the consequences on these various medical procedures, and the likelihood of them failing or succeeding?
Hmm.
I mean, you did just talk
Well,
to Buck Angel, and part of Buck Angel's trans journey is, uterine atrophy. Some pretty intense stuff happens to the female body when it's subjected to exogenous masculine hormones or male.
yeah. I guess I just saw whatever was written, and I mean, basically the only negative side effects that I had heard of were the increased like heart attack risk, maybe blood pressure issues, blood clots, things like that. Things that as a kid really don't phase you because you take your health for granted at that age. Like
Yeah,
you just think you're invincible. I mean, I
yeah,
would like at the same age that I came to the conclusion that I was trans, I was like running around the gym at school and like smashing my body into the mats that were hanging up on the walls and trying to
yeah,
like see how far I would bounce. Like this is the type of like,
yeah. I live with a couple of
hyperactive
those kind of people.
like this is the type of kid I was. So I didn't do I mean, I wish that the side effects of these medications and interventions were stated more clearly. And it seems like the only reason they're being stated now is because you have this wave of detransitioners and regretters saying, like, I was sold these lies. I was not informed of the risks, and this is what happened to me. And that like played a large role in my decision to desist. But before I desisted, I moved to the Middle East and I lived as a man, stealth for 4 years, and I integrated myself
Well,
within
which
both
was more
culture,
stressful, pretending to be a man or pretending to not be a lesbian?
pretending to not be a lesbian.
Okay. So when you
Yeah.
were playing the role of a man, you just kind of did it. There wasn't a lot of stress hanging over you, or if you get found out, caught.
So oddly enough, no, um, because I thought like it, I didn't have to like create an entire like male alter ego. Like simply, I went by a male name and I got a binder. But other than that, like I didn't have to
Okay.
change anything about the way that I like walked or talked or acted.
Oh, okay.
People in that society, they just don't know what masculine lesbians are. I mean, in Tel Aviv they do, but I wasn't in Tel Aviv. I was hanging around religious cities in Israel and in the West Bank. I
Was
was
there
like,
any
well,
danger from that faction towards you?
Well, now that I think about it, it was an extremely dangerous route that I took, but I didn't perceive the danger at that time, because basically I was able to very, very seamlessly integrate both within like ultra Orthodox Jewish circles and within religious Palestinian Muslim circles. And these people just automatically assumed that I was a guy that just looked really young for some reason. Like they
Hmm.
didn't pick up on it. And it would have been much more, dangerous for me had they figured out that I was actually female, because then they would have figured out what was going on, and that would have been like a really big deal. But
Hmm.
I it was much easier for me. Like I didn't even like without even medicalizing, I was able to integrate pretty seamlessly into life in that part of the world. And I realized that I could do that. I mean, do you want me to just explain this like arc of the story?
Yeah. Here we are.
Okay. Yeah, here we are. So when my parents had found out that this whole trans thing wasn't going away and that I was living at university as a guy in the United States, they
And
basically
sorry, did you get on testosterone at that point?
no, like I didn't medicalize at all.
Okay.
I
Okay.
didn't medicalize at all. Because of course through college I was financially dependent on my parents, and that was, that would have been a condition for withdrawing that support. And so I basically, when my parents had figured out that I was still living as a guy, one of the stipulations that they had made is that, like, you're not going to medicalize and you're going to do a study abroad for a year in a country that doesn't support all of this stuff. And previously, I had been to Israel for like an 11-day trip to study the Israeli Palestinian conflict at an institute in Jerusalem. And the
All
reason that
right.
I was selected for this is because I actually used to be one of those pro-Palestinian campus activists. Not the rabid ones that we're seeing today. Like what we're seeing these days is just a totally different level of insanity and violence. But basically, a few of us Jews were co-opted by the pro-Palestinian side to be to act as, like, sort of, for lack of a better term, human shields against their anti-Semitism accusations. And the Jewish campus organization had called all three of us, the Jews who were part of this pro-Palestinian group, in and talked to us. And the director of this organization had said, "Look, I can tell that you're very intellectually curious, but I just don't think you're getting the whole story. And we're going to do a trip to Israel to study this conflict at an institute in
Hmm.
Jerusalem, and we'll pay for everything. And if you just apply, like, and you get in, like, you can come with us, and everything is covered." And so my girlfriend and I at the time, we went on this trip, and from the moment I got there, I realized that I was being lied to about this conflict. And the reason why I was so vulnerable to this type of brainwashing really is because I'd started studying Arabic when I was 12. I went to a school, just a regular public school, and for some reason they had an Arabic program for the first time ever. And this program was funded by the Qataris. And if we know anything about the Qataris, it's that they're very sympathetic to Hamas. They house Hamas members in their massive mansions. So while they, throw the people of Gaza into endless wars, they themselves live lavishly in Qatar. So obviously there was a lot
Hmm.
of sort of jihadi sympathizing ideology that was taught to us along with Arabic language and culture since I was 12, really. And so, and also at these debate camps, they were like super lefty, and they gave us a topic lecture about Israel Palestine, and it was taught by some like random white dude who wasn't Palestinian, wasn't Jewish, wasn't Israeli, wasn't Arab, he wasn't anything. He really, frankly, wasn't even very intelligent. He basically just gave us, like, pro Hamas talking points, and I
Hmm.
was the only Jew in the room. So naturally, all eyes were on me, and I was like, I was so scared. Um, and I felt guilty. I felt like I was responsible for all the evils in the world. So that didn't help me very much,
Oh,
especially, yeah. So that didn't help me at all. And so of course
Semitic
I was
guilt.
very,
It's like white
yeah.
guilt, but acute.
So that's the story of how I got involved in like pro-Palestinian campus activism, how the Jewish organizations discovered me, helped me out, sent me to Israel for like 11 days. And so after the institute was over, my girlfriend and I decided to extend our trip, and we'd spent a couple days in the West Bank as well. and to see the other side of what was going on. And on the first day, we were in a refugee camp in Bethlehem, and the second day, we were staying at an Airbnb of a Palestinian multimillionaire. So about as different backgrounds as you could possibly get, and
Just on your own.
with just me and my girlfriend. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you two on your own doing this, not being
Yes.
shepherded through this.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
The institute had a very clear sort of schedule to it, but our trip to the West Bank, that was just us.
Okay.
And as we were moving from one city to the next, we'd gotten on the wrong taxi. We basically get off at the wrong stop, and we end up in a different city. My girlfriend and I with our massive suitcases, and we're stumbling around trying to find somebody who will help us navigate. And so the two of us, we walk into a coffee shop, and the owner of the coffee shop comes out. He can immediately tell that we're tourists because of our suitcases, and he becomes super excited because they don't get a lot of tourists. And he welcomes us in, my girlfriend and I. We sit down. He gives us free hot dogs, free coffee. He says, "Welcome to Palestine." He asks us where we're from, why we're there. We have an amazing conversation. And his English was decent. And my girlfriend and I were sitting there, and we had realized eventually at some point that everybody who was sitting in this cafe were men. And this is because in Arab cities, most of the time, cafes are sex segregated because it's a homosocial culture. And there's not a lot of mixing of the sexes. It's a traditional culture in that way. And somewhere in the conversation, I had told the owner of this cafe, who was who was exuding great hospitality towards us. I told him that I actually spoke some Arabic, and his eyes lit up, and we started speaking in Arabic. And he had referred to me in the masculine. And that's the moment at which I realized that actually my girlfriend was the exception to the all guys rule in the cafe, because this owner had clearly thought that I was a guy. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, something clicked in my head when I realized that, wow, while in the United States, this type of, attire that I wear and the way that I go about in the world will get me perceived as a masculine female. But here in this part of the world, people will just assume that I'm a guy. So actually, here I can do the thing that I've always wanted to do and live as a man. And so when I had to pick a study abroad location, which, based on what my parents said, it couldn't be in like a European country, couldn't be in the West. And so I thought, oh, Israel, this is perfect. So while they thought they were rescuing me from the trans mess, I was going in full force. And that's the story of how I started to live stealth in Israel for several years. So that's sort of how that started.
What was the consequences of living stealth, other than like the complexities of your parents from afar? Like, what did that do for you or to you? Right, you're just living as a guy. Yeah. Other than like whenever you use the bathroom, you just have to be careful of stalls. But I don't even know if they have bathrooms out there because I don't know anything about that culture. That was a bad joke. I'm sure they have bathrooms there, but they do. To what degree? It's just like urinals.
Yeah, they value privacy in that part of the world. Like the stalls, the craziest thing about coming back to the States is that the bathroom stalls, like you can see people's entire feet.
Oh, okay.
From under the stalls. Like there's much more value on privacy even within single sex spaces.
Okay, so that wasn't a worry for you then? Getting caught, found out, smoked out.
No, it wasn't. I mean, there were a couple close calls, but it was actually more with the Tel Aviv liberals who wanted to virtue signal by asking me what my pronouns were in front of my conservative, like Arab Muslim friends who thought I was a dude. Like, so there were some really awkward and annoying situations with these types of liberals who would ask me, oh, what are your pronouns? And at first they'd ask me in Hebrew, and I just pretended like my Hebrew wasn't good enough to understand them. And then the bastards switched to English, and they said, "What are your pronouns?" And I just looked at them like, "What? What are you talking about? Like, what's a pronoun? What? I don't know what you're talking about."
That's cheeky.
I'm pretty good at weaseling my way out of situations.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, I mean, it was, in a way, it was pretty seamless, but there were always worries. Like, I was always paranoid of like, is the binder not binding well enough? Is somebody going to figure it out?
Were there consequences? Because that's not natural. I mean, I guess bras technically aren't natural, but those things that those binder things can have some consequences. I guess you weren't necessarily
Yeah.
developing through puberty at any time, but did you get some downstream effects for that?
Oh yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah, like there's this uh, back to the early trans discourse. I'm now remembering something that would have answered one of your previous questions, but like as in regards to the negative health consequences with binding, for example, there was all this discourse back in 2012 of like, get your binder from underworks. Don't bind with ace bandages or duct tape because this is dangerous. But even when I was like 12, even though they said don't do it, I was like, well, that's all I have at the house. So I tried to do that. It didn't really work so well for me. I would like double up on sports bras, like, but
Did you was it about dysphoria, whatever that actually means about your breasts, or was it just about like looking different than you naturally looked? Did you actively dislike or want to disown your female body?
well, I was very uncomfortable with my female body because the masculinity that I wanted to
Emulate, yeah.
portray and the masculinity that I think is, for me, it's actually just, it's not an act. Like just the way that I go about in the world without trying.
Yeah.
I find that, like, yeah, it's just very natural for me. It's a type of gender nonconformity that's very well known to be associated with homosexuality.
Yeah.
So I mean, as a 12-year-old, I'm sure there was just discomfort just around developing and stuff like that. But I mean, as soon as I got this idea in my mind that all of these traits equal me having a male brain and a female body, of
Yeah.
course, I became like the distress that I might have just had that could have gone away with puberty and with having like fulfilling intimate relationships and romantic relationships with women, which is what we know happens to a lot of these gay kids who experience distress around their bodies and their biological sex before puberty, is that, in loving relationships, and once they finally figure out what's actually going on with them, they come to more internal peace with themselves. But because this idea was introduced to me so young, I staked
Yeah.
my entire future and my sense of self on it. So
Would,
yeah, like the yeah.
yeah. Do you would you are you fine with Target selling binders in the preteen shopping section for girls? I think that's okay.
No, like not even remotely.
Yeah. Why not?
Like
I
it's
mean, but you would want it for yourself.
I totally would have wanted it, but there are all kinds of things that kids want that are just irresponsible to give them,
Okay.
that are
So,
irresponsible to sanction for them.
okay. So you, from this point of view right now, from your desisted point of view, from your post trans identity or man identity, because it wasn't even a trans identity, it was a man identity, faux man identity
Right.
in the Middle East. From this point of view, you would say that those desires should have been what, talked out of you, discussed. What kind of help would you have responded positively to during your formative years?
Well, there was a couple year period in my formative years where I had some issues with my posture, and so I basically wore this like very tight sports bra that was essentially, it was supposed to pull my shoulders back and improve
Yeah.
my posture. It was like a medical garment, and it
Huh.
did like compress my chest, and that, and not to the extent that a binder did, of course, but I felt the least distressed around my body and like my breasts when I wore that thing. So I think that like parents who have a daughter who's like really distressed about their breasts, just like get your daughter fitted for like a properly fitting sports bra. Like don't try to force her to wear some like feminine piece of lingerie for any reason. First of all, because those things, most 14-year-olds or whatever would be like very scandalized by having to wear something like that. It's highly sexualized, and it's just an uncomfortable from like a sensory perspective piece of clothing. So just like I would say, yeah, like, the trans movement is saying, well, binding isn't good for you, but there are safe ways to bind and not safe ways to bind. I don't think that there's a single safe way to bind. They're basically saying don't use duct tape, don't use ace bandages, but use a binder from like a reputable company. I don't subscribe to that idea anymore because I did that for like 7 years, and like
Wow.
I don't see a way of coming back from that. And they'll say, don't wear it for more than 8 hours a day, but it's addictive. And especially when you're living a double life where you can't get found out,
Yeah.
like you sleep in that thing. Like there are so many nights I spent like overnight doing like peace activities between Jewish and Arab children in like a Bedouin village, and we'd stay overnight. And so I had to sleep in the thing. I mean, and that's
Hmm.
extremely dangerous. Like once you get somebody started on that idea and hooked on that idea, um, like it did a couple things for me. One of them is that I never had to come to terms with my female body as like a permanent state. I thought that
You
basically
could
having a female body was
escape
a
it.
temporary state of pathology. That
Hmm.
my female body was in itself a pathology, but that pathology existed in a temporary state that could be corrected from the moment that I became financially independent from my parents.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I never had to integrate my breasts as like, a part of my body. Like I have to do that now. But I should have been doing that at a much younger age.
Okay.
So there's a lot of delayed development that comes as a result of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Your story, or just how you're depicting your life, it's so many, like so much intervention has happened in your life, like from a medical point of view or from a corrective point of view, and like but there's been trade-offs to all those things, there's been trade-offs for all these things. And seems like you kind of adopted the mentality that was put on your body about this is a thing, there's problems with this thing, and there's ways to rationally, through ingenuity and will, correct this thing. And then like, what about accepting the thing? And now you're like, okay, well, no, actually I have to re-engineer how I even treat my body, how I see my body, like from the ground up, before even being, dealing with the whole woman thing. Just like, what is this thing that I'm in? It's not uncommon for certain people to think life itself is a pathology. Just being embodied itself is the problem, So at least you got that going for you. You're just being a woman is a subset of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that your assessment of that situation is both interesting and I would say spot on. Some people definitely think of just being alive as pathology. I didn't ever go that far. I loved life.
Yeah.
I loved life so much that it really compelled me to desist at some point, and that was really a character arc. I mean, there were seeds of doubt along the way the entire time, but like it was very easy for me to ignore them. Like one of them would have been when I was like 19, and with a girlfriend of mine, we were reading the book Stone Butch Blues, which is a piece of like lesbian literary canon, and the main character. And this book takes place several decades ago. The main character actually medically transitions, and she loses a lot of touch with the lesbian community because people stop perceiving her as female.
Hmm.
And she describes that as being quite a big loss because at some point, like she couldn't relate to the men because she wasn't actually a man. I mean, she was working amongst men, in blue collar work as butches in those days did, whether or not they medicalized. They sort of did what I was doing, in the 2020s. But
Hmm.
like, so she lost touch with the lesbian community, and I had a bit of an oh shit moment, and I realized like, wow, I have never given myself a chance to live as a lesbian. I've never, because the way that this person described her experience and her relationship to her body and her relationship to like, sex roles and things of that nature, it rang so true for me. And for the first time, my experience was described as something that was not the experience of, somebody born with a male soul and a female body, but rather as a subset of a lesbian experience. And
Hmm.
so I had this little thought in my mind of like, I've never allowed myself to just live as a lesbian. But the problem is that already by, 2018, those lesbian communities, there was really no trace of them, certainly none that I could find, and none in my age group. Everybody was going, queer and trans.
Hmm.
So that was the first seed of doubt, which I put into the back of my mind and totally ignored. And then just went off to live as a man in Israel. But where the big seed of doubt was planted that eventually allowed me to desist was actually, I believe that I would trace the process of my desistance back to a bomb shelter that I was in May of 2021. I was living through my first war in Israel. I was absolutely terrified. Out of nowhere, I was actually with a different girlfriend supposed to go to a drag show in Tel Aviv. And we just kept delaying leaving the house because things kept coming up. And then eventually, sorry. Um, Eventually, before we left the house for this drag show, we had heard a siren, and automatically, like, my body started shaking. I was really scared. I looked at my girlfriend. I was like, what are we supposed to do? She's like, they're launching rockets at us. We need to go to a bomb shelter. And I said, well, where's the bomb shelter? She said, I don't know. I'm new to this neighborhood. So we ran down the stairs and we just stood at the lowest level of the building because you're less likely to get hit by a rocket when you're not on like the top level of a building. And then eventually we looked up where the bomb shelter was. And so we were running back and forth and we had to put the cats in the carriers and just like it was a massive ordeal every single time. And bomb shelters are particularly depressing places to be because for somebody of my generation, especially because there's no Wi-Fi in there. So you just can't distract yourself. Like you're hearing these rockets go over your head. One time I didn't make it to the bomb shelter in time and I hid under a tree and I just saw 3 rockets go over me like one after the other and they rip through the air and then they're intercepted by the Iron Dome and there's just a big boom and it shakes the foundation of any building you're in. You can even feel the ground shake in the bomb shelter. So you just don't feel a sense of security and there's no Wi-Fi. So I couldn't distract myself. I was just stuck, like totally paralyzed. And it was hard to just get up and walk back to the apartment, even after we'd waited recommended however many minutes after the last siren to go back, because there's a protocol around all of this. But anyways, in between trips to the bomb shelter, because this was an 11-day ordeal in my first war, which nobody could really prepare me for, or anybody, nobody's prepared for this type of thing to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I'd gone back to the apartment in between my trips to the bomb shelter, and I made the mistake of going on the internet and going on Instagram. And I saw all of my lefty American friends posting all kinds of horrendous things, basically saying that Israelis deserve to live under rocket fire. And they were justifying every single atrocity that had been done in the name of the Palestinian people. Basically, they were super pro-Palestinian and extremely anti-Israeli and bordering on and sometimes crossing into being just incredibly anti-Semitic. And their pro-Palestinian position, I had realized, was not the same as my pro-Palestinian position, because these American lefties who were, tweeting and Instagramming from their comfortable couches in California, living in safety, about, tweeting about our situation while we were living under literal threat of death by rocket. I could clearly tell that they were disconnected. And I thought, well, I was naive and young. And I basically thought, well, I was just like these people before I lived through a war and before I realized that I didn't know anything about the Middle East. And yet I was young and I thought I knew everything. So simply what I need to do is, I knew a lot of these people from debate and things like that. I thought, I trust my ability to engage in effective argumentation with all kinds of rhetorical techniques, a decent grasp of like ethos, pathos, logos. I knew which logical fallacies to stay away from. And I basically thought, look, if I just go and give them some hardcore, like verifiable, credible evidence to show them that Hamas is a terrorist group that is not only making the lives of Israelis a living hell, but is actively terrorizing the Palestinians that these friends of mine claim to care about so much, and putting them in harm's way in order to achieve their jihadi mission of like obliterating the Jewish state. And they don't care how many Palestinians they drag down in the process. Like if I can just prove this to them with data and facts that exist, that they'll incorporate this into their logical calculus. So that was my naive young idea. I realized
that was not realistic tact.
Right.
No.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah. Like I pretty quickly figured out that, these people who I thought were like these types of evidence-based, fact-based people, I was operating under the assumption that they didn't have a full set of facts, when really when I presented them a fuller set of facts, they called me a colonizer, a settler sympathizer. A lot of people just unfollowed me and blocked me immediately. So that was one kind of wake up call about
Yeah.
this whole
Okay.
like leftist ideology. But the bigger part and how this plays into the journey of desistance is that we all know that algorithms are incredibly powerful. And around the time of this war in May 2021, the newest iteration of the American culture wars were raging. And I wasn't in the US, so I didn't see it from that element, but I did encounter it when the algorithm started feeding me more stuff that was in line politically with a basket of ideas to which the pro Israel position belongs, which is on the more like right wing side of the culture wars. So the algorithms started suggesting me all kinds of right wing content, including those compilations of woke TikToks. People were like reacting to woke TikToks. And that's the moment in which
You
things
cringed for the
like,
very first time.
yeah. Yeah, because I wasn't involved with the trans community. Like
Yeah.
I didn't like them from the very start, like because they wanted to be trans and I wanted to be a guy. I wanted to be normal and they wanted to be, they wanted to have crazy
Special.
multicolored haircuts. Yeah, so and they weren't curious. They weren't intellectually curious about anything. So I just didn't relate to them. And even in the United States, instead of hanging out with the trans crew, I hung out with a bunch of Saudi international students. Like I always just gravitated towards the Arabs. Even as this really odd type of Jew, I still always gravitated towards the Arabs because I think, well, with Russians and Arabs, we have a certain cultural sort of cohesion or understanding, general bond. Like in Israel, Russians and Arabs marry each other all the time.
Really?
Yeah,
What is
it's
it
like a
about
whole
that?
thing.
This is anthropological and kind of a segue, but what is it about the mindset of those two cultures that syncs up?
Well, there's a certain level of like traditional gender roles. Also, both Arabs and Russians, they have this sort of almost like colonial or like empire type of mentality. Like we come from these great empires. Our people have brought about like literature and beautiful ancient songs,
And
folk
strength. Yeah.
dances, strength. Yeah, like there's a certain level of pride in that, pride in traditional values, pride in the literary and sort of cultural achievements of your people. So I think that's what it has to deal with. But yeah, so I was much more in that camp. Like I was always very different from my peer group in every sense. I mean, even living as like a normie guy in Israel, there was nothing normal about what I was doing. First and foremost, because I was actually a woman masquerading as a man, with very little effort required in order to achieve that. But also because I didn't, just because I was Jewish, I didn't fall into one side of this conflict. I really wanted to make peace because, the only reason I reconnected to my Jewish roots coming from a Soviet or post Soviet background where, because of communism, religion was illegal, it was punishable, you could go to jail for that. So Jews lost their religious connections. They maintained their ethnic, their sense of belonging to a peoplehood, but certainly any kind of religious or cultural rituals that were associated with religion were not allowed. So the only reason that I even decided to reconnect to Judaism in the first place and to go to a synagogue at all is really because I had started studying Arabic from a young age. Like that's the only reason why it even ever occurred to me. So I saw my Jewish identity and like this sort of whole peace activist thing. Like I basically saw the fates of Israelis and Palestinians as being like inextricably linked with one another. And I knew that I had a certain level of cultural understanding and speaking all of these languages, like speaking the most commonly spoken languages in Israel. It was easy for me to be a cultural liaison. And that's what
Yeah.
gave my life a lot of meaning and a lot of purpose. So
Is
I did do that. Yeah.
is peace possible?
Good question.
Is it
I think that
desirable from the point of view of those who continually instigate the opposite? And I'm sure there's more than one party that's doing that. Not saying one doesn't do it more than the other, but I'm sure there's a lot of vested interests in perpetuating the opposite of peace.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, the entire reason that like the pan Arab nationalist movement which was really started in the early 1900s. That was and really totally spearheaded by Egypt in the 50s. This idea of we're not Jordanians or Syrians or Egyptians, we're all Arabs, we belong to this big Arab nation.
Hmm.
This idea, was a response to the Middle East being carved up into a bunch of different countries starting in the 1900s. And this idea is what's really pushing along the Palestinian national movement. This idea that the entire region is an Arab and Muslim region. Well, first it started as this entire region is an Arab region, but then political Islam joined the proverbial group chat, so to speak, and that's when things really became, that's why we see this iteration of this type of jihadi violence. So, I mean, it used to be in the Arabs' interest to try to, to hold up to create the idea of the Palestinian nation or the Palestinian peoplehood in this way and use it as basically an excuse to continue to try to erase the Jewish presence in the region. But now all kinds of Arab countries are realizing that they made a massive mistake because they weren't able to obliterate Israel. No matter how hard they tried, they weren't able to do it because the Jews just don't want to be genocided again, basically. And they realized also that the more they advocate for the types of terrorist groups that want to take down Israel, those terrorist groups eventually will find a home in their countries and cause problems in their countries. So now we see a trend with the Arab world wanting nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots of all kinds, and not wanting anything to do with this type of stuff. So I don't know if that's sort of the answer to the question you were going for, but I think a lot of people are invested in war, certainly.
I'm wondering, I mean, so there's a discussion of whether any sort of identity, ethnic identity is at all desirable, but then there's, then eventually liberalism comes in and nobody has any identity and there's everything's an airport and it's just so there's that opposite extreme there. But I'm wondering if the notion, because I don't have a problem with what the word anti-Semite or anti-Semitic is describing, which is specifically a notion of bagging on Jews. But it's a problem because when we're talking about, Arab Palestinian and Israel and the conflict there, and any sort of criticism of Israel is just being anti-Semitic when we're it's just a bunch of Semites fighting. So how can you be anti-Semitic if you're one? I'm wondering, so that's a segue to the question of, do you think that there's a Semitic identity that includes a brotherhood of, Mohammedans? I know that's a term that's gone out of fashion, but all the children of Abraham getting along, all the Semites. Is there a Semitic or Semite identity that might be a segue toward, harmony in that region?
Well, it seems like the Abraham Accords that were spearheaded by Trump, which normalized relations between, so far it's been the UAE and Israel and also Morocco and Israel. And there were more the whole reason why October 7th happened is because Hamas, as a proxy of the Iranian regime, didn't want normalization efforts to succeed with Saudi Arabia, because Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting a war for regional hegemony as well.
Yeah. So, okay. And didn't America kind of give a bunch of money to Iran right before Iran gave a bunch of money to Hamas? That's something else somebody else brought up. I don't know if you know. I don't know the details of any of this stuff, but the United States is doing a lot of crap, playing a lot of different things too. I don't think that my government is particularly.
I mean, everybody has their grubby little hands in this conflict. Yeah. Everybody wants a peace. The land is super contentious, and everybody wants to everybody wants to blame the Jews as being the one spot of non-Arab Muslim dominance in the region, as if the Jews are the reason why this conflict is happening, as if Israel is the reason why this conflict is happening. And that might be a solid argument to believe if there were no other conflicts in the Middle East.
Okay.
But this is a region that is highly prone to conflict for a variety of reasons, and it would take several hours. We could have a several hours long discussion,
probably a mini series,
why that is the case. But as far as a vision of peace, I mean, I always really wanted, like I always was striving for peace. Like I was part of a community with Jews and Arabs and internationals, and we weren't like a political activist organization, but we were just a group of people of all ages, from young toddlers to older adults,
Hmm.
and we would do peace events together. We would go on these hikes in the West Bank. We had
You'd guys
children's
be
events.
lobbing love bombs at each other.
Uh, yeah, I
Sorry.
guess. Well, no, that's an interesting. It's an interesting
I was
comment
trying
or
to I was trying
language.
to envision like a love what did you call it, a peace peace event?
Yeah, peace community, or yeah.
Yeah, it's the
Uh,
opposite of a war event. So what would be going on at these peace events? Like a potluck, maybe a parade, some
we
music.
did, yeah. I mean, we did have we did all kinds of crazy things together. We had very tame events for kids, um,
Hmm.
and we also had like crazy raves in the desert. And
Hmm.
we ended up getting caught by the cops because we didn't get the right permits and things of that nature. And I think both the Israeli and Palestinian police were not super enthused about the fact that there were Jews and Arabs hanging out in this area and like selling alcohol illegally and doing all these other
Yeah.
things. And I think that our gathering, from the perspective of the authorities, was dangerous. Um, but yeah, so I mean, we did all kinds of crazy things together. But I guess I think that Jews and Arabs have a natural connection because we do come from the same, we come from fundamentally the same roots. And the whole idea of like a Semitic identity, I mean,
Hmm.
you know, the Semitic identity, it refers to the class of languages that Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and other languages, a lot of whom are like
That's
totally
fair.
extinct or partially extinct,
Yeah.
belong to. Those are Semitic languages, root-based
Hmm.
languages. Um, and I really do believe that like on the ground, anything is possible. Like if I don't have any faith in warmongering politicians or just straight up terrorist groups that run the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank. Like I don't have any faith in them. I don't have any faith in any of these like warmongering groups that are funneling weapons into a conflict and not addressing any kind of root cause of like radicalization, and things of that nature. But I do think that on the ground, I mean, what really shook me is that, on October 6th, so the day before all these atrocities were happening, I was in a Bedouin village running a peace event with Jewish and Arab children. And it was so optimistic. We did arts and crafts, we had dances, we had a little birthday party for a couple of the kids. We made sure that all of that there were kosher options for the Jewish kids who were religious, and obviously everything was halal, because kosher is more strict than halal is. But we made sure that everybody could eat. Everybody had something to eat, something to enjoy. And if a kid fell down, it didn't. It was the nearest adult who helped them. Who wiped off their tears and comforted them. It didn't matter if that adult even spoke the same language as them. So in the environment of a village, like we all came together, Arabs and Jews, like Muslims and Christians and Jews, and it didn't
Oh
matter.
my.
Like and the kids didn't even have a common language, but yet at the end of the event, all of the kids would come out with like a few words in Arabic or Hebrew or Russian or French or English or whatever they were speaking. They would just teach each other.
Specifically curse words, right?
No, not at that age.
Okay,
Thank God.
good.
We're talking about kids who are sort of school age, beginning school age and younger. They were little kids.
Yeah.
And I was so optimistic, and and I had posted something on Instagram talking about like, hey, if we just invest in our kids, like we can't control what our politicians do or what any of these outside parties that want to keep us at perpetual war with each other are doing. But we can invest in our kids and teach them from the youngest of ages that they are each other's neighbors and each other's potential best friends, not each other's enemies. And
Yeah.
then a few hours later, I woke up to a siren, and everything, my like world changed in ways that like I am still trying to process. But
Yeah. Hmm. That's such a thank you for speaking to that. I host a lot of conversations, and I'm always aware of like these other conversations that they're going on that don't necessarily get spoken about on my channel. So thank you for allowing the conversation about your relationship to, I guess, a trans identity or to a male identity to segue into your relationship to this incredibly complex and very contentious topic. But speaking about transition, desistance, you kind of gave me hints. You said you loved life too much to continue. What was the defining moment when you're like, you gave up that particular masculine ghost?
What do you mean by masculine ghost?
It was just a turn of phrase. When did you decide to stop? But I guess you didn't trans, so when did you decide to desist? When did you wake up? When did you make peace with this identity and start to do the work of like reordering your relationship to your sex and to your social sex or your gender?
Mm. Well, there's not a super clear answer for that. I was talking earlier about how trying to convince my lefty American friends that they were wrong about something that they were convinced that they were right about, and how that led me down an internet rabbit hole because of algorithms and like,
yes.
So that's basically how it started. Like I started to get exposed to more information that just didn't conform with the dogma that we were all expected to accept.
Yeah.
As liberal, peace-loving people. And so that's basically how it started. And for several years, I was delving deeper and deeper and deeper into the gender rabbit hole. And at some point, I'd come across the first stories of detransitioners. And the first story that I saw of a detransitioner, I listened to the entire thing. I wasn't, particularly sort of worried about shattering my worldview because that had already happened on several occasions. So I wasn't like hesitant to watching this video. Because the entire time I was really, although I was like committed to living as a guy, some part of me did want to figure out, like, is there a way that I can make peace with myself and take a road that isn't so complicated and that is so unknown? Like, is there a way to achieve a type of normalcy? And when I started going down this internet rabbit hole, I realized that trans was not that type of normalcy, because people were starting to talk about medical complications and things of that nature. And also, I mean, well, for the other reason that I wanted to live in the Middle East, I wanted to live in a country that's extremely prone to war. And what we're seeing now with this war is just something that's extremely long and drawn out, that is undoubtedly affecting supply chains. And even from the age of 12 or 13, I knew that if I were to get, for example, a hysterectomy, I would be reliant on pharmaceutical hormones for the rest of my life. And what's worse than flooding your body with a bunch of cross-sex hormones is to have no hormones in your body whatsoever. And that's very likely when you live in a war-prone or war-torn country where supply chains are impacted. Like, it's just unpredictable. So that was part of it that made me sort of reconsider. But it was, the road to desistance took such a long time for the specific reason that the early stories of detransitioners that had come out, I mean, the very first wave was older people like Walt Heyer, who is older and, an evangelical Christian. So automatically, like, I couldn't relate to anything he was saying. Like, one, he was a guy from a different generation. And so then I started seeing these like young women speaking out. And at first, I mean, I just couldn't relate to their stories at all, because I had gotten into it so early that there wasn't this element of peer influence. It wasn't being pushed at every direction. It was something that it was mine, this trans identity. This was mine. Like, I got into it by myself before everybody else did. And it wasn't like I sort of passively saw it somewhere and then got hooked. Like, I'd seen it with older males under the idea of a sex change, and I'd sought this out myself. So I didn't feel as if I was indoctrinated into anything, at least at this point when I was starting to see these like these first detrans stories. And additionally, I like seeing these women. I mean, I didn't want to detransition because they had gone, they'd posted pictures of themselves from their transition phase where they looked, very masculine. They looked like men, a lot of them. And then they basically, when they detransitioned, they became very feminine in their appearance. And that is something I didn't want to do. Like I like also a lot of these women, they were feminine and heterosexual, and they got caught up in this, peer group type of social contagion. So I thought, well, okay, these are like feminine straight girls. Of course, they're going to regret this type of transition. I don't know why they did it in the first place. Like that was my thought at the time. Even when I had seen a couple of these types of women in my peer group taking this transition path, I also thought, like, why are they doing this? It doesn't make any sense because they're straight. Like only gay people do this. Why would a straight person? Of course, now I have more information about how like social contagions work and all this other stuff, and that there are more factors at play. But back then, like I just didn't relate to their stories. And so I thought, well, surely this means that I'm the truest of the true transsexuals. And so I was in that camp for a while. I was in the true trans camp for quite a while. And then I was sitting around in the true trans camp, and eventually I had realized there were some pretty significant ideological inconsistencies with the true trans camp. And I'd realized that after being in that camp for a while. I'd gone from like from being trans, but being disconnected from the trans community and not knowing how it was evolving exactly, because I was just living stealth, to being totally in the true trans camp, but not fixating so much on gender, because I still had a very rich life outside, but that life was built on a false premise and under a false identity, to then realizing that all of these treatments are extremely medically risky, and that basically the best case scenario for me would be that if I transitioned, I would have been fine with the social role. I would have been happy with my aesthetic appearance. I would have liked all of that stuff, but that I would have had some unforeseen medical complications that would have endangered my life in an area of the world where I might not always have access to the type of emergency care needed to save my life at the last moment. And that would be the best case scenario for transition. The worst case scenario would be that I intensely regretted it, had medical complications, and had this crippling sense of what if, and after going past the point at which I could have just lived as a lesbian. Like I had never given myself that chance. And I had a feeling that, what if I grow up and I do take this path and I regret that aspect of it, and there are medical complications? Like that would be the worst case scenario. And I looked at the best and worst case scenarios, not under this like sort of rose colored goggles way that kids look at things, where it's like, oh yeah, I'll become a man and I'll just drive happily off into the sunset. Like I had reconsidered everything and realized that was not the best case scenario. That was an extremely unlikely scenario. But rather, like I looked at the best and worst case scenarios as reality presented them, and I realized that none of them were good options. But another thing that happened is that, I was illegal in Israel for several years, so I just didn't have access to healthcare, and I couldn't medicalize. I mean, that's what saved me. But I basically worked as a caterer and as a cleaner within the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And I dressed like an ultra-Orthodox Jewish guy. Like I had the yarmulke, I had, the black and white clothes, the ritual fringes. And,
Aren't you, I'm sorry, like, are you not violating their religious principles by behaving as a guy? I mean, I guess it's none of their business. You're just fitting in. But was there any kind of like, I'm not doing what they think I'm doing? Pulling a fast one on the Jews, man. I guess you're a Jew, so you can do it. But is there any worry about that?
It's prohibited, but like I needed to make a living somehow, and I could only do cash jobs because I was illegal. So
okay. Oh, and so you weren't ingratiating yourself into their community, participating in their rites and the rituals. You were just working for them and living among them as them.
Yeah, temporarily living as, I would work, sometimes they would have me stay over for like dinner or something afterward, but in general, it was a profession. It was what I was doing at the time, to make some money. So it was a necessity. But yeah, like I mean, obviously it's forbidden. I mean, cross-dressing is forbidden in Judaism. Um,
And
but
both
like,
ways. Like
yes,
women dressing as men. I mean, they in our culture we don't have as many or
right.
traditionally we don't have as many strictures on women's. Well, I actually have to rewind that back. We've always been policing dress. It's just the 70s came along and everything got really relaxed, and now we're back on being uptight about it. So
Yeah. Yeah, like it's a traditional society. I mean, it's everything that you would expect of a traditional society.
yeah.
But like the moment I guess that I sort of really started to more seriously evaluate whether or not transition was the life path that I personally wanted to take, like when I took it out of the intellectual realm and tried to implant it into the embodied realm, was when I ended up a couple of
Mm.
weeks after becoming legal in Israel and like becoming a citizen and being able to leave the country. I ended up at this conference in Ireland in Killarney, and for the first time in my life, I had met detransitioners in real life, including a couple booked lesbians. And that's the moment at which I realized like not all of the people who regret this path are like these feminine straight girls
Mm.
who got duped into something. Like we all got duped into this thing. And even very masculine lesbians whose stories are very similar to mine could go down this path, have gone down this path, and have regretted it nonetheless. So that's the moment in which I started to like really reconsider medicalizing, because from the moment that I became an Israeli citizen, that was the first thing on the list, even though I had already been contemplating gender critical ideas for a couple of years at that point. I had never considered how that would apply to me because I was still in the process of working through it intellectually. So this did end up being like a 12-year journey of my life. But the moment in which, like, and then I went back to Israel after that conference, and in the conference they talked about the lack of evidence base for these treatments and explored the topic from a highly intellectual and research based perspective, which was already more alluring to me than just
Hmm.
a bunch of dogmatic and ideological points.
Yeah.
So, like, your side of the debate already had me simply at the fact that you guys were the intellectuals and the thinkers, and everybody else they were just basically being sheeple and trying to justify practices that have
We have
no
a sense of
evidence.
humor too,
Yeah,
just to add that to the mix.
yeah. You guys are pleasant to be around,
Hmm.
which I could not say about the other camp
Well,
necessarily.
depends on what we're fighting over. Things can get kind of rowdy over here too, but that's another conversation we don't have to
Yeah,
dive into talking
yeah.
about
The
Jim's fight.
infighting,
But
yeah, the infighting is inevitable. I think instead
yeah.
of thinking of it as a good or bad thing, I mean, every single social movement or religious sect or anything has had schisms and fractures. Like the Amish, different sects of Amish occurred because, like,
Hmm.
one group of people believe that the brim of a hat should be like 3 inches, should be like 3.5 inches, and so they split over that. So like people infighting is inevitable. There's really not much you can do about it other than creating an overall environment of like pluralism and free speech, and also just when
Hmm.
people go into things in bad faith, there's really no way of protecting against that. Like at that point, schisms are inevitable. But if everybody goes into a goal with with at least one common goal, like I think in this case, the common goal is, you know, fighting the idea that there is such thing as a child who's born in the wrong body. Some people say
Yeah.
there's no person who should transition. There's no person who, is born in the wrong body. But all of us, at least in the gender critical camp, are under the impression that this is a dangerous path and that children cannot consent to this dangerous path. That's the basic sort of thing that
Yeah.
everybody's in agreement on, and the schisms happen after that point. Um, but anyways, back to the whole back to my personal sort of process. Um,
Would you,
after Yeah,
if you were, I mean, if I guess if you're put in the situation of living in a traditional culture, would you go back to living as a man for the sake of your aesthetic preferences and in order to, walk around with a pretty woman on your arm? Or are you at a state now where you're being honest about yourself and saying, well, maybe I just don't fit into traditional cultures. Like it's hard enough to kind of like just have peace with my gender nonconformity in a marginally liberal or supposedly liberal society. What's that calculus for you?
Hmm. Well, part of the reason why, like right when I went back to Israel after that conference, that I didn't immediately desist or detransition or tell everybody that I was like lying to them for 4 years. I mean, some people knew, but not very many. Is precisely because of that. Because I just didn't. First of all, it's like I've woven this entire web, complex social web, where I have people who are extremely religious who are not allowed to like even give high fives to a member of the opposite sex. And so they've been giving high fives to a woman this entire time and didn't know. And certainly for the men, it would be much less
Yeah.
scandalous to them personally than it would be to women who realized that they were being like high fiving a man this entire time, because women in these types of traditional societies have much less freedom to screw up than men do.
Yeah.
But like basically, I mean, everything becomes complicated because I was working with kids as well. And so that was another like web to try to figure out, because now I sort of have this other moral conflict, which is that I fundamentally believe that no child should be exposed to this idea in the first place. And so, I have two conflicting moral frameworks. That's one of them. The other one is that you shouldn't lie to kids about your sex or their sex or just reality. So obviously I was lying to them about what my biological sex was. Not in those words, but just they knew me as a guy. But that conflicts with a premise that we shouldn't expose kids to this idea, because if I were to come clean and tell them the truth, then these kids would be exposed to the idea of transgenderism in the first place, which is an idea that I do not want to plant in their minds. So what I've essentially realized is that basically, like, when I go back to Israel, I'm just going to have to go to a different city, to a much less religious city. Like I was thinking of moving to Haifa, where there's a lot of like coexistence with Arabs and Jews. And there's a big gay scene there as well. A big, like probably the biggest gay Arabic speaking scene in the entire Middle East, almost certainly is in that city. So, there's still possibilities. Like Israel is a tiny country, but it's extremely diverse, both with opinion and like ethnically, and sort of with the cohorts of people that are there. So there are still possibilities for me to integrate within that country. But like, so I'd gone back to Israel after this conference, and I didn't desist. I mean, I told some friends about what I was going through, like mentally, and what I was trying to figure out. And they asked, like, so what do you want me to do with this information? Like, do you want me to tell other people? How do you want me to handle this situation? And I said, look, it's just going to be too complicated. Like because I speak the most commonly spoken languages in Israel, like I know basically like everybody in the city that I was living in. Like I knew everybody. So it would be just impossible. It's such an undertaking to reverse how everybody sees you, especially when I didn't really have to coerce anybody into believing that I was a guy. They just naturally assumed that. So in a way, I would be telling them to defy the way that they were perceiving me, in the way that a lot of trans activists do, like the "it's ma'am" guy in the GameStop or whatever. Like the whole trans movement in the West is trying to coerce people into not trusting their eyes and their ears, and simply, my existence just being gender nonconforming in the Middle East. If I were to try to get everybody on board with seeing me as a woman in a society that, in a city especially, that is incapable of seeing somebody like me as being a woman, like it just wouldn't even occur to them. Outside of the gay bar, it wouldn't occur to anybody really. So I don't want to basically upend the social fabric of an entire city in which I was very socially active. So I would probably just have to move to a different place. So that's sort of answering that question.
Yeah. So where are you at now? I guess we opened the conversation with you doing this activist thing. So you're not altogether against activism. We know that. But what are your goals now? Like, what are you speaking out toward or for?
Mm. Well, I think my goal with activism, well, first and foremost, is to give the perspective of the gender non-conforming kids who are likely to grow up to be gay or bisexual, because it's a phenomenon that's talked about like in the gender critical space. Everybody knows the kids who are like on the autism spectrum or who have like traits of ADHD, or like all kinds of comorbidities, or just being gay, like that these kids are very vulnerable to falling prey to gender ideology. But I don't see enough, I guess, diving into the psychological reasons behind that. Like, I think that a lot of parents, of course, when their kid starts identifying as trans, and takes on this totally different persona and simultaneously becomes like very socially withdrawn, and their prospects in life just tank because they're ruminating about about all kinds of negative things their entire day. Like, parents obviously and understandably become concerned when they see that. And I've noticed, a certain discourse that I think that, needs to sort of, we need to sort of be careful with some of this discourse. Like, there are certain, I would say there are definitely some parents who are giving other parents information about how to get their kids to desist. And they come up with very, very helpful points. But I do notice among that crowd a certain panic. Like, there were some parents who were talking about how the school did this very unjust, like socially transitioning the child under their parents' noses, keeping it a secret, and like basically referring to the child by male name, male pronouns, and giving the child a binder. And in the same breath, they'll say like they did all of these things, and also they gave my child male's clothing, and my daughter cut her hair. And I think we should be really careful in lumping all of these things together, because one is not like the other. Obviously, the affirming a false identity, a cross-sex identity through the name, the pronouns, and the binder, those are extremely dangerous psychosocial interventions and medical interventions as well. Those are dangerous, and they put a child on a specific trajectory. And those are not my words; those are the words of Hilary Cass and of all kinds of other experts in this field. But simply having a gender nonconforming appearance should not be a cause for panic. And if parents treat that in the same way as they treat like name, pronouns, and binder, I think it actually might cause a lot more damage or harm to the kid than they might realize. Because if it is just a phase for your kid and they end up growing up to be straight, like for no reason, you're just damaging the relationship with a teenager, because you're causing a rift to happen over what teenagers have done forever, which is experiment with unconventional clothing and hairstyles. Oh, and yeah. But if the kid grows up to be gay, then it's really harmful to rail against the gender nonconforming appearance in the same way as you rail against the cross-sex identity, because you're basically telling the child that it's not only is their trans identity problematic, which I would argue that it absolutely is, and that's where the pushback needs to be about accepting one's biological sex. But to tell a child, to try to basically push back against the entire, like, everything that you see this trans identity to represent, including the gender nonconforming appearance, you're basically telling that child that, you're a girl, and so you have to wear this type of clothing and these, like, basically what I'm trying to say is enforcing the non-conforming child who is likely to grow up to be gay will further entrench the internalized homophobia. It will alienate you from your child, and it will push that child closer and closer and closer and further and deeper into that trans identity, because they genuinely, because of the like naivete of youth and the black and white thinking that these kids are prone to, they will believe that their gender nonconformity, rather than being a natural aspect of possible homosexuality or of just being on the autism spectrum and not picking up on social cues, like they will believe that this literally means that they are a member of the opposite sex and that they have a body that needs to be corrected with dangerous and experimental treatments. So I think people really need to separate the type of intervention, which is name, pronouns, and binder, from haircut and clothing, because they are not the same. And so that's part of my activism, is that I'm trying to, like, because I've been through this process for, 12 years, and my story is not a story of like explicit medical harm.
Mm-hmm.
My story is more one of extreme psychological upheaval, and like the type of things that can happen to a person and the type of lengths they will go to, in order to live out their trans fantasy and their trans dream. And I basically want to like provide some insight, both for the parents and for these young kids, a lot of whom are gay and lesbian, into like what's actually going on in their mind. Because when I was starting to desist, what delayed that process for me is only seeing the version of a detransitioner who becomes extremely gender conforming and heterosexual. And I think that for a lot of these trans identified young people, including the ones who've transitioned and who are really at their core feminine gays and masculine lesbians, I think that there isn't enough of a push within the more mainstream element of the gender critical community, to sort of like, and it's actually, I don't think it's a problem with the gender critical community. I think it's more a problem with the more mainstream media that wants to find the most sympathetic, figure for their movement. Like it's obviously very tragic when a feminine girl, who's going to grow up to be straight, loses her breasts to this evil, like, butchering ideology, and who is masculinized by testosterone. Like, that's so obviously a tragedy that everybody can see it, and the level of that tragedy is so visibly obvious that it's easy to sort of use that type of person, to be like the political person who is representing your ideology, and who is basically an antidote to the ideology of you need to affirm pronouns because it's the nice and compassionate thing to do. But a lot of people, I think on the right, especially the more traditional right, I'm not talking about like all the gay people who have left the left and are becoming right, but I'm talking about the more traditional right. I don't think they realize that it's equally as tragic when a child who's going to grow up to be gay loses their ability to like have sexual function, to have a healthy body, to have fertility, and to have their body intact, because gay people deserve that too. And so I want to provide like some insight, not only into what 12 years of trans identification meant for me, even without medicalization, but specifically as the type of person that I am. But also I want the younger versions of myself to see what I have to say, and to realize that there is another way for them to be. Like, they don't have to be gender conforming members of their sex, and they also don't have to subject themselves to all kinds of dangerous experimental treatments to be like a pseudo gender conforming version of like an imitation of the opposite sex either. Like, there's a place for people to just be, and that's sort of what I want to. That's like the main goal of my activism, is like melding the political activism with the intellectual.
Were you suggesting that you have a dissociative identity disorder? Is this like the next thing after the trans thing, that you have many versions of yourself running around? Is that what you're saying? That's a joke. I'm joking.
No.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
That was, yeah. Because you're talking about talking to yourself and all this
stuff. The younger
that's all the
versions,
rage
I was saying the younger.
Yeah, that's just all the rage too. That's the next.
Yeah, that's right.
Brave new world of TikTok social contagion. Like I'm part pony.
Well, they're already doing it.
Yeah, they're already doing it, and it's actually not. It's not all that new. They've been doing that for years and years, because people being weird on the internet is what the internet is all about. Maia, so you, I guess you're traveling around, you're getting the word out, you're doing these podcasts now. You were on Buck Angel, now you're on Benjamin Boyce. And do you have plans for this summer? Or is it imminent that you will be returning to Israel, or are you waiting for some sort of peace process, which doesn't seem to be nearing for some reason?
Yeah, I'm waiting for the situation to cool down a bit, because ultimately I want to launch myself into adulthood and find a professional path. And that's very hard to do when your entire job. Well, I'm still figuring that out, but I mean, I really greatly enjoy research and academic writing, public speaking. I mean, I enjoy what I'm doing now. And I mean, the dream would be to make some kind of career out of this, not just to be stuck talking about gender, but like in in other podcasts like that I've done with Buck and with Carol and Shapeshifter, I've been, discussing also and with you as well, I've been discussing the interplay of like gender and Israel. And I'm right now doing some research basically comparing the case study of like how the Islamic State recruited a bunch of Western youngsters to join their radical death cult, and the similarities between that and how like these groomer trans activists are recruiting Western children into, the clutches of gender ideology. And I've been seeing a lot of similarities between those cases, a lot of overlap, not just in the recruitment tactics that are related to specifically like the new age of cults, which exist online and then bleed into the real world, but actually in the cleanup. Like, how do we clean up these international scandals, these mismanaged international catastrophes?
Yeah.
Like with all these, foreign fighters now being located in Iraq and Syria, and like, what do we do now? Like, what do we do with all these kids who were born in the ISIS caliphate and like have no prospects? Like, the international community is going to have to come together to try to repatriate all these people and to try them for their crimes. And on the other hand, like the parallel I'm seeing with gender is also that like these treatments were pioneered in the Netherlands. All of these interventions, they were pioneered in the Netherlands, but the social contagion element where transgender became a zeitgeist, a cultural zeitgeist, that's a facet and a function of American cultural dominance. It's an American idea that has found its way into all corners of the world, including in Israel. And I've written a paper about that. So I see a lot of like areas of overlap between these two situations, just the situations themselves, the discourse, and I'm working on research in regards to that, and I don't want to focus on gender, for the rest of my life. And I frankly hope that this crisis and this massive medical scandal, with all of us speaking out and with all of us taking action and doing research, that we will bring this entire mass atrocity to its knees. But then there's going to be a world in which you have all of these kids who, in their foundational years of identity development, like I was, sold the lie that they're members of the opposite sex. And even without medicalizing, that's a lie that's destructive enough to one's like burgeoning identity and sense of self, that even without medicalizing, it's psychologically catastrophic. But then these kids will medicalize, and they're going to have, because of the new surgeries now that they're doing to try to sidestep the fact that these kids didn't experience enough pubertal development, especially the boys with the genital surgeries, they're going to be doing increasingly more like radical and experimental body modifications. And emergency rooms are going to, like, the entire medical, healthcare system of the West and even in other parts of the world are going to have to deal with this. They're going to have to figure out, like, how do we treat all of these patients with iatrogenic, conditions, harm that was caused in the purpose of treatment, and how are we going to treat these people who have these new complications that we as doctors allowed to happen, and when we can't even like identify the biological sex of a patient who might come to us unconscious. Like, the aftermath of this scandal is so gargantuan that we need to start thinking about that now. Because we didn't, when we were thinking about defeating ISIS, we weren't thinking about the aftermath of what do we do with all of these foreign fighters, all of these ISIS wives, and all of these innocent children who were born into them, but who are now being radicalized.
Yeah.
And like, we're radicalizing a generation of kids, and we need to learn from like other scandals and other aspects of history in which mass generations of vulnerable young people were radicalized into doing something that is dangerous with international level proportions. Like, we need to look at the way that, like, the reason I'm doing this research is because I believe we really need to look at the way that the world, mismanaged this jihadi recruitment, not just with ISIS, but also now on college campuses. We really need to start like developing a collective sense of pattern recognition and seeing when we're falling into the same mistakes. And we need to start thinking about the day after now. Like, while we're fighting what's going on now, I believe that there absolutely needs to be a subset of us, a subset of the gender critical community and the intellectual community that needs to figure out, like, how are we going to handle these cases therapeutically, socially, medically, like how like this in ideology has just put its dirty little tentacles into every single institution of Western life. And we're going to need to claw it out of every single institution. And it's going to leave splinters. It's going to leave, little splinters of wood that can easily be reignited in entire wildfires if we don't figure out how did our institutions become so vulnerable to this in the first place? Like, is it about the bureaucratic internal structuring of institutions? What makes Western institutions in a free society so vulnerable to, on the one hand, unevidenced bad ideas, being vulnerable to them, and on the other hand, to proliferating them like wildfire? Like, we really need to have like a come to Jesus moment in which we think critically about what aspect of our society and structuring of our institutions allowed us to be so vulnerable to this and to do so much damage and proliferate that damage to the rest of the world. And like, how can we prevent something of this magnitude from happening again? Like, we need to start having those conversations now. So that's also like a direction that I hope to take my research and my activism. So maybe that's what's next. I mean,
wow.
If it's not peace in the Middle East, like,
it's the implosion of the United States government or the global American empire. That was phenomenally based. I like that. I want to end the conversation on that tremendously leading, fiery speech that you gave, because I talked to a lot of the dissident right people who are right along with you right there. So it'll be interesting to catch back up with you in a couple of years and see just how far down that particular rabbit hole, rabbit warren, whatever. I want a new word for it, but however far down that path you go. Maia, can people find you, and where can they find you, and what can they expect when they do find you on the internet?
So you can find me on Twitter. I am at the Peace Poet. Peace is in world peace 99. So that's at the Peace Poet 99. And I'm considering maybe creating a YouTube channel. I've also been working with an Israeli social worker, writing a book about my life. That's like optional donation, and it's in a bunch of different languages. We also have books that we've worked on for kids called A Dog Stays a Dog, or What Makes a Dog a Dog. And there's a boys version and girls version, and those are for little kids. And we have a series of books that we're working on for the teens and young adults. And they're available in English and in Hebrew for the books for the older population. For the little kids' books, just tons of languages. And the proceeds from those books go to help detransitioners in Israel, and also even some detransitioners abroad, just detrans activism in general. So I'll give you the link of that, and maybe you can put it in the bio.
Could you say it out loud? I'll definitely put it in the description, but what's this project called?
Well, the project is with Reality Based Publishing, which is an independent publishing organization that I'm doing with this Israeli social worker, who's the only professional in all of Israel who's speaking out against this madness with her name and face attached to it.
Nice.
So we're working on that, and I'll send you all of that information as well. But yeah, feel free. Anybody who finds me on social media, like, feel free to reach out. I love meeting new people, and part of what I love about doing this activism is not just the full immersion in all kinds of fun intellectual ideas and debates, but the incredibly insightful and intelligent and kind and compassionate people I've met, such as yourself. And just thank you so much for having me on. Ever since I discovered your channel, running in and out of bomb shelters, I've developed a particular affection for the way that you have conversations. I think you have a fascinating way of interviewing people, and you just ask very unconventional questions that actually made me think about something. So you gave my brain a little kickstart, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's been great to meet you in this strange little corner of discourse, Maia. Thank you so much, and I hope we can meet up for coffee someday, insofar as we both stay in this area of the world. I'm going to end the recording now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Boom. Cool.